Okay, well, it's 2:30. For those of you who have just joined us, I'm Patrick Saylor. I'm the Director of Marketing and Public Relations for the American Civil War Museum. Welcome to the 7th Annual Civil War and Emancipation Day. I must say that it's quite rewarding to see the number of people that have come out today. It's not really great weather-wise, and we appreciate it. And so on behalf of my colleagues and the historians who have spoken and whatnot, we really do appreciate it, and thank you for being here. Mandy Tompkins has her bachelor's degree in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she will be graduating with her master's in history from VCU in May. Congratulations. She has worked at Richmond National Battlefield Park and the American Civil War Center. She currently serves as the Digital Learning Assistant at the Virginia Historical Society, and this talk is part of her master's thesis. Let's welcome Mandy Tompkins.
Good afternoon. The first few days of April 1865 changed the lives of Richmond citizens forever. Union troops helped extinguish the fire set by fleeing Confederates, and the occupiers quickly set up stations for the destitute to receive food and clothing. Richmond citizens had feared the occupation of their beloved city, yet they were surprised by how well the Union Army conducted themselves. While maintaining order and aiding the poor, the Union occupiers did not harm any citizens or cause destruction. My project, part of a larger master's thesis, crafts a lost narrative about how elite white Richmond women experienced the fall of their city and the first couple of months of Union occupation. Richmond women did not exhibit the same behaviors as Confederate women elsewhere because of the respect issued by the Union Army. Rather than ignoring the occupiers or being rude and disrespectful towards them, the women began to see the occupiers as their protectors, especially when it came to the black troops and newly freed slaves. And these are just some of the women whose diaries and letters I studied to complete this project. So as 1865 pressed on and evacuation of Richmond seemed imminent, people in Richmond obviously began to fear occupation. They had heard horror stories from places like Atlanta and New Orleans and places even closer to home like Norfolk and Fredericksburg, of the Union Army just going in, breaking into people's houses, taking their possessions, even setting some of their homes on fire. Historian Stephen Ash writes, "Visions of looting and savagery spawned by old stereotypes about the barbaric Yankees seized white imaginations." One Richmond woman, Catherine Cochran, kept a scrapbook that I found of just where she had cut out newspaper articles of all of these Union horrors, as they called them, throughout the South, and she had just glued them into a book to look at. So, perhaps most of all, the women in Richmond feared the overturned social order that would come with occupation, because once the Union Army entered the city, the slaves would be emancipated. To the women, slaves were what made these women elite, and when they did not have slaves, they did not know what that would mean about their status. Historian Drew Gilpin Faust writes, "The most privileged Southern women were those who defined themselves and their status in relation to the slave institution on which their privilege rested." Not only were these women worried about the social order, they also feared retaliation once the slaves were free. In Mary Chestnut's diary, she wrote about her cousin who was killed by her own slaves, and that was even before emancipation. So they only feared that it would get worse with emancipation. So on this day, 151 years ago, as the fire is spreading throughout the city, and the Union troops have broken through at Petersburg, the Confederate troops that are fleeing set fire to the city on April 2nd. So now the women are not only worried about the incoming Union Army, they're also worried about this fire burning down their homes and businesses, or families' businesses. So there's stories of them trying to take out any personal property they can from their homes and taking it to a safe location. They're also hiding personal items in their dresses because they fear that the Union soldiers will try to take whatever they can. So as April 2nd turned into April 3rd, the fire is still burning and the Union Army enters on the morning of April 3rd. They raise the American flag over the Capitol for the first time in 4 years. And at first, Richmond women are ordered to stay inside, and that was fine with them because they did not want to look at the Yankees. They write about hating them and hating seeing the flag over the Capitol. But they quickly realized that the Union Army, at least in Richmond, is not there to destroy their city or take their property. General Order Number 2 is issued that says that soldiers can't enter property or take anything without a specific order. And the main goal of the occupying army at first is to put out the fire, which they do. They post guards on every city block. They put blacks to work clearing the debris as soon as possible. They also divide Richmond into 4 districts and set up relief commissions to help the poor. Now, the federal governor doesn't get into the city until the very end of May, so it's really the occupying army that's in charge during these 2 months I look at. So after a few days, the women do begin venturing out, and they're surprised by the respect shown them by occupiers such as these men. Virginia Dade, a woman living in Richmond, writes, quote, "To our surprise, we were treated by these with the greatest respect and courtesy." Now, these women knew that they should be thankful that they were being shown this courtesy because they knew that they could be treated as enemies and the Union Army could make their lives miserable. So in a letter to Mary Custis Lee, Marietta Powell writes, "I think, dearie Mary, we should try to give them the credit they deserve, for it was in their power to have made our lives a perfect burden." And I came across this quite often, women writing their thanks to the Union occupiers, which is very different from women elsewhere. On the other hand, the Union Army was also surprised by the women in Richmond's actions, because in places like New Orleans, the women had been cursing at, spitting at, even dumping their chamber pots on the Union Army. So the troops kind of expected the same, especially from the women in the capital city, and they weren't getting that. Northern War correspondent Charles Page wrote, "The ladies of Richmond have manifested no such venom as the ladies of Fredericksburg were accustomed to exhibit 2 years ago." So women first began venturing out to actually ask for help from their enemies. So they go to the provost's office to ask for food, to ask for supplies, even asking for private guards to stand outside of their house to protect against looters and other criminals. So these same men that they had feared entering their own house just days before, they're now asking to stand outside their house for protection. While relations with the white occupiers were fairly cordial, the USCTs, the United States Colored Troops that made up part of the occupying force, and their relationship with the women was what brought a struggle, at least according to the women. Historian Chad Williams writes, "As an accessible target of white hostility, black soldiers represented a perceived social, economic, and physical threat to Southern society in the wake of emancipation and the defeat of the Confederacy." So seeing these armed soldiers walk into their city was quite astonishing for these women that had viewed blacks as property for their whole lives. And many of the women write about negative experiences with the colored troops, as they called them. And I do have to clarify that these are all allegations. I haven't found proof that these instances actually happened. These are just the women writing about it. So for example, Fanny Braxton Young had a silver plate stolen from her house, supposedly by a USCT. Emma Mordecai writes about several negative interactions with USCTs, being disrespectful to her, as well as breaking into her house and stealing some of her possessions. And White occupiers were quick to respond to this behavior. They were quick to punish black soldiers. They tried their best to retrieve any stolen goods. I know that Emma Mordecai had her horse returned to her that was taken. Fanny Braxton Young had her silver plate returned. But all of this complaining by the women got so bad that by the end of April, Ulysses S. Grant actually ordered all colored troops out of Virginia. So the women did not have to deal with them for very long. Now, as I mentioned earlier, women were also worried about what emancipation would bring to their status. They also worried about retaliation and revenge, and I didn't find any instances of that in Richmond. Just from the small sample I looked at, the main issue I saw was that women were struggling to do the jobs that their former slaves had done. So they write about not knowing how to do stuff. They write about trying to find servants to do the jobs, but they don't have any money to pay the servants, so that's a problem. But they are still worried about their class status, their status of being elite, but they quickly realize that the Union occupiers are not going to let their elite status go away just because there are no more slaves. So the Union Army was not going to just let the freed slaves run wild. So they set up a curfew that blacks couldn't be out at night. They set up a pass system where black men, at any time of day, if they were on the street, they had to have a pass written by their white employer and signed saying what their job was. And black men couldn't just go to the provost's office and get rations. They had to also have a pass saying that they had a job. So the Union Army was not just going to give handouts, which really pleased the women. So the women's slaveholding status may be gone, but they were still the upper class, and blacks were still considered inferior based on all of these rules and procedures. So pleased with the occupiers' response to the black troops and newly freed slaves, women were less worried about their daily lives. Some even began socializing with the Union troops. George Barnum was one of those Union occupiers who was in Richmond in April, and he summed up the women's experience quite well when he said, "They supposed when the Yankees came that their lives and property would be in danger, but after we had been here some time, they could not fail to see how well we Yankees conducted ourselves and with what respect and kindness we treated them." Now, a year later, in April of 1866, it would be a different picture. The same freed blacks that the women had been worried about began celebrating Emancipation Day. Confederate dead were still left on the battlefields around Richmond, and many of these women began to form ladies' memorial associations to memorialize the Confederacy, and kind of took a step away from socializing with the Union forces. But that is a story for a different time. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you mentioned that women had all of these ideas of what might happen to them in even the scrapbook.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that they are thinking of what had happened earlier in the war? Do you think that perhaps since the war was virtually over in the minds of Union soldiers, that prevented any of these sort of worst-case scenarios?
I think in a way that both the women and the Union troops were ready for the war to be over, and that definitely helped factor into both of their actions. And I don't want to. The women definitely did not like the Union troops at first, so I don't want to seem like they were all friends. They did write about hating them and everything, but just the strange dichotomy of hating them and then trying to get them to protect their houses was very interesting. Yes?
I think one of the anecdotal stories that came out of that early period just after Union occupation was right there at Mrs. Robbie Lee's quarters, where there was a guard placed in front of her house, knocked at her request, pay with lunch for this guard, because as you said, they rather appreciated the fact that there was, in a house full of women by themselves, a man with a musket standing outside their front door.
Yes, I did find many instances of women even inviting the guards into their homes to eat. And they also took in troops as boarders. Now, that was also a way for them to make some money, but I don't think they would have done that weeks before, so. Yes.
I've got the impression in other places that the women were kind of keeping things going while the men were away fighting. So as the men were coming home and starting to assert themselves and these sorts of things, are you seeing any sort of mention of that or any sort of backlash
Yeah,
to that?
so I don't go too much into that because the men are just returning home in the 2 months that I study, but the occupiers do enforce rules, like John mentioned, the one where they can't wear their insignia or buttons. The men also have to take the loyalty oath, and so that's, the women touch on that in the 2 months I study, but definitely if I continued on, they would mention it more, I think. Yes.
I was just wondering, you talked about the women being worried about looters, but there's so many Union soldiers there. Was looting really a big problem?
Looting was a problem on the night of April 2nd, so before the Army had gotten in. Once the Confederate Army left and set the fires, the prisoners escaped, and so there was looting going on. But once the Army got here, it wasn't much of a problem. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.